All right, everyone, settle in. Tonight we're exploring something very relatable, sleep. Or, more accurately, how medieval people slept, which, as it turns out, is far weirder than most of us could possibly imagine. So, before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate what I'm creating here. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always genuinely fascinating to see our audience connecting from all corners of the globe. Now, go ahead and dim those lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's smoothly transition into tonight's journey together. Before the age of electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influencers, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would utterly baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. This approach was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep cycle divided neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was straightforward. After sundown, most individuals would retire early, drifting off into what was known as first sleep. Then, after approximately 4 hours, they would deliberately awaken and spend the next hour or two engaging in what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This was not considered insomnia. It was simply how sleep functioned. The watch period between the two sleep segments was perceived as practical, useful, and occasionally alarmingly social. People utilized this time to pray, read religious texts, tend to the fire, or check on their livestock, because nothing disrupts your REM cycle quite like wondering if your goat is still in the yard. And yes, this interval was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals noted that the body was well rested and calm of mind during this period, which sounds suspiciously like a polite way of saying too tired to argue. So if you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just remember, your ancestors were setting the bar very differently. The second sleep would follow this interlude, lasting until sunrise. Everyone from devout monks to hardworking farmers participated in this nightly rhythm. Even literary figures like Chaucer casually mentioned it, confirming that even in medieval literature, people were writing about fragmented sleep. Oddly enough, modern science has suggested that segmented sleep might actually be a more natural pattern for humans. The two-sleep cycle aligns closely with how our circadian rhythms function in the absence of artificial light. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't panic. Just whisper, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and go tend a symbolic fireplace. It wasn't until the industrial era, with its factories, gas lamps, and a growing societal fear of unproductivity, that humans began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours, as though sleep were a timed sport. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a failure. It was simply the expected schedule. And everyone adhered to it, whether they desired to or not. Let's talk about beds, or more accurately, the medieval approximation of them. In today's world, we obsess over thread counts, revolutionary memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress feels cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a collection of organic material that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unvoiced regrets. The typical peasant bed consisted of a straw mattress known as a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a crude sack of rough fabric, if they were fortunate enough to possess a sack. If not, it was simply straw directly on the floor, possibly damp and perhaps already claimed by a feline. These pallets were far from comfortable, but they were a significant improvement over nothing, which was the readily available alternative. Straw was inexpensive, readily available, and provided decent insulation against the cold. It was also an excellent harbinger for insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, transforming sleep into an exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If something bit you, you merely shifted slightly and hoped for the best. If a family possessed a bit more money, or at least a functional back, they might elevate the straw mattress onto a basic wooden frame. This didn't dramatically alter the sleep experience, but it did marginally reduce the chances of awakening with beetles in your ear. Linens were a rare luxury. Most people slept in the same clothes they wore all day. Pajamas were not a widespread concept, and neither was personal space. Entire families, children, parents, perhaps even a grandparent, all slept together in the same living space, sometimes on the very same straw pile. If you became too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow. Nobles, of course, enjoyed proper beds, large wooden frames, soft feather mattresses, intricately embroidered sheets, and elegant canopies to keep out drafts and hopefully the pervasive lice. These beds were so valuable they were explicitly bequeathed in wills. You didn't inherit land, you inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Still, for the majority of medieval people, a bed wasn't a sanctuary of comfort. It was primarily a place to avoid freezing, to keep away from the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of one day being wealthy enough to sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. When we hear nightcap today, we typically think of a cozy alcoholic beverage, perhaps something with whiskey, enjoyed by a warm fire, often preceding a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a drink. It was quite literally a hat, a real, tangible, often rather absurd-looking piece of fabric designed to prevent your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation was not exactly the strong suit of medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment offered minimal protection against the cold. And central heating? That was commonly referred to as a dog. So, to keep their heads warm at night, especially since body heat rapidly escapes through the scalp, medieval people adopted the humble nightcap. These hats came in various shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, resembling something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were typically made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warmth could be spared without angering the family goat. For men, it served as a practical accessory. For women, it sometimes functioned as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and concealing hair that hadn't encountered soap since last Lent. But beyond mere warmth, nightcaps also carried social significance. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, yes, even while asleep. And the cap itself could be intricately embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth or social status, because nothing says success quite like retiring to bed with a miniature flag adorning your skull. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a widely recognized symbol of being off-duty. If you opened your door while wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of conveying, "I'm not dressed for conversation, and yes, this hat does mean go away." Of course, nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, but without the accompanying haunted moral lesson. Sleepwear was not considered sexy, but it was undeniably practical, often itchy and occasionally flammable. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is generally confined to long-haul red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up. But in medieval Europe, this practice was completely normal and not at all optional. Let's say you're a traveling merchant, a devout pilgrim, or simply someone whose mule unexpectedly gave up halfway to Norwich. You manage to find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and request a place to sleep. What you receive is not a private room, or an individual bed, or even a particularly clean patch of floor. What you get is a designated spot in a bed that is already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy was simply not an expectation. If a bed had available space, you were expected to share it, usually with complete strangers who might loudly snore, talk in their sleep, or possess a suspicious number of boils. This was not considered rude. It was merely an efficient use of limited resources. Beds could accommodate 2, 3, or even 4 travelers, depending on their size and the prevailing social tolerance. In larger cities, you might find yourself in a dormitory-like hall filled with rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests remained unjudged. Elbow territory was fiercely contested. Sometimes men and women were assigned separate sleeping areas, but this was not always the case. Some inns attempted to assign beds by profession. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, and allegedly, thieves with other thieves. But often, it was simply a matter of first come, first sprawled. And while this might sound like a nightmare to modern germaphobes, Back then, it was a significant upgrade from sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. Concerned about theft, many travelers slept with their coin purse securely tied to their belt or cleverly hidden under their clothes. Others slept on top of their bundles, effectively transforming their luggage into both a makeshift pillow and an impromptu alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to awaken poorer. The wealthy, of course, did not suffer this fate. Nobles traveled with extensive entourages and camped in relative comfort or simply demanded their own private rooms, provided the innkeeper valued their roof and continued business. In the medieval world, retiring to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a serious spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes involved your eternal soul. People didn't merely sleep, they meticulously prepared to potentially die. Hence the widespread popularity of bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with heartfelt confessions, solemn psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses, just in case they passed away somewhere between good night and dawn. The underlying idea was simple. You could die at any given moment, from sudden illness, fire, demonic influence, or most perilously, simply being over 30 in the year 1247. So you'd better say your prayers. Not because it was inherently comforting, but because the concept of hell was terrifying, and you certainly didn't wish to arrive there uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. One common version of these prayers began, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sweet, right? Except it's essentially a legal document written by a 7-year-old, candidly acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults maintained a whole catalog of prayers for various potential threats. One for when you felt guilty, one for when you suspected the devil might be hiding in the rafters, and one for plague prevention, which unfortunately aged poorly. Some even prayed specifically to saints renowned for watching over sleepers, akin to holy bouncers diligently guarding your soul at the club door. The truly devout monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles concluded their day with Compline, the final communal prayer service before bed. After Compline, they strictly observed a vow of silence, which wasn't particularly challenging given that everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly apprehensive of the dark. Children were also strongly encouraged to pray, partly for the benefit of their souls, and partly to provide them with something to occupy their minds other than asking why the dog was in their bed yet again. Parents frequently reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, prayer before sleep was less about achieving inner peace and more about last-minute spiritual damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You desperately hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully comprehend its mechanics. In the modern world, dreams are typically dismissed as random nonsense, manifestations of stress, the result of too much late-night cheese, or simply your brain attempting to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously indeed, as in eternal consequences serious. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were considered direct messages from God, revered saints, the insidious devil, your personal guardian angel, or potentially that peculiar relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were perceived as divine revelations. Others were seen as demonic temptations. Regardless, you were expected to pay close attention and possibly meticulously write it down, or confess it immediately, or embark on a 3-day fast, just to be on the safe side. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries dedicated an alarming amount of time to interpreting dreams. Entire scholarly texts were devoted to decoding their complex meanings. Dreamt of fire? That might signify hell. Dreamt of water? That could mean purification or, ominously, drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish? You'd better summon a priest immediately and possibly consider relocating. Medieval people believed that what transpired in dreams held profound significance because your soul was still actively engaged while you slept. This implied that your actions within a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealthily stealing a loaf of bread? That might be your subconscious mind confessing your underlying guilt for real-world gluttony, or perhaps just genuine hunger. But still, it was deemed better to confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns frequently recorded their dreams and shared them with their spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for experiencing holy visions during sleep. Others were gently advised to consume fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't solely spiritual puzzles. They also served as excellent plot devices. Medieval literature is replete with vivid dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or enigmatic metaphorical creatures eloquently spouting poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, albeit with significantly more allegory and notably fewer happy endings. The church, predictably, maintained a suspicious stance. Not all dreams were considered divine, and some were believed to be maliciously planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamt of something unwholesome, it could signify that your soul was under attack. Or perhaps that you simply slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some individuals allow their pets to sleep in their beds. It's a cozy, if occasionally aromatic, arrangement. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was primarily a practical heating strategy. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes were not exactly constructed for comfort. Stone walls, absent insulation, and drafts so aggressive they likely possessed names of their own, did little to retain heat. Central heating, that was more commonly referred to as the family pig. In peasant homes, it was entirely commonplace for humans and livestock to sleep in the very same room, sometimes even the same bed, and very often the same large pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely, dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snorted softly beside the hearth, and if you were fortunate, none of them decided to bite you during the night. This practice wasn't primarily about affection, although medieval people certainly cherished their animals. It was about fundamental survival. Animals generated essential body heat. They were warm, dependable, and unlike some relatives, did not monopolize the blanket. A large dog could effectively prevent your toes from freezing. A cow situated in the corner might elevate the room temperature by a degree or two, which in the depths of January felt nothing short of miraculous. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, frequently comprised just one multi-purpose room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, and occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same limited space. Children might find themselves nestled between their parents and a goat. A chicken might inadvertently serve as an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene? Let's refrain from asking too many probing questions. For wealthier families, this arrangement was less common. Nobles typically did not sleep directly alongside livestock, though they might still have indulged in lapdogs in bed, not for warmth but for fashion and the amusing redistribution of fleas. Some castles even featured separate sleeping areas specifically designated for favorite animals because nothing conveyed power quite like a dog possessing its own room and title. There were, of course, inherent drawbacks. Animals can be loud, they can wander unpredictably, and they are not, historically speaking, renowned for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof inadvertently landing in your face at 3 a.m., just an accepted part of the bedtime routine. If you've ever accidentally drifted off while sitting upright in a lecture hall, a bumpy carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably awoke with a stiff neck and a profound sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an unfortunate accident. It was a deliberate lifestyle choice for some. Certain medieval individuals, particularly the wealthy or the religiously devout, opted to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? For a few reasons, none of which were particularly conducive to restful slumber. Firstly, there was a prevailing medical belief that lying flat was detrimental to digestion, lung function, or the overall balance of the bodily humors. In a world where doctors seriously believed a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this peculiar logic made perfect sense. Upright sleeping, they theorized, helped to avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous but primarily meant don't drown in your own phlegm. Secondly, there were significant spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered too closely aligned with the posture of the deceased. You definitely didn't want to confuse God, or worse, attract unwanted attention from the angel of death by sleeping in the same position commonly used at funerals. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest also doubled as the community's health consultant, you learned to choose your battles carefully. As a result, people often slept partially reclined, supported by large bolsters, numerous pillows, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval lazy-boy. Nobles sometimes had their elaborate beds ingeniously rigged with angled supports to maintain a semi-seated posture, deemed perfect for digesting one's evening meat pie or fending off sudden demon attacks. Monks in stricter orders took this practice a step further. They might even sleep sitting rigidly upright on a hard bench or leaning against a cold stone wall with nothing but a hood to muffle the inherent discomfort. This wasn't about health, it was about rigorous discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m. Needless to say, this arrangement was not conducive to quality rest. It was primarily about virtue, discomfort, and mildly confusing theology. Forget haunted dreams or goblins lurking under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already intimately present in their sheets, small, persistent, and utterly uninterested in your earnest prayers. We are referring, of course, to pervasive fleas, ubiquitous lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial, unwelcome mascot, the bedbug. Let's not attempt to sugarcoat it. Hygiene was not exactly medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare luxuries, laundry was prohibitively expensive, and soap was sometimes concocted from substances better left unnamed. Add to that straw-filled mattresses, often shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken wandering underfoot, and you possess the perfect environment for an all-you-can-eat pest buffet. Fleas and lice were so common they were practically considered permanent roommates. Peasants dealt with them daily as a matter of course. Nobles, despite their luxurious satin sheets and plush feather beds, were by no means exempt. In fact, some wealthier households even employed dedicated nitpickers, actual servants specifically tasked with meticulously removing lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine that as your prestigious job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bedbugs, meanwhile, functioned as the silent assassins of medieval sleep. They cunningly hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the tiny cracks in stone walls, emerging stealthily at night to feast like minuscule vampires. If you've ever wondered why medieval people consistently wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it wasn't always solely about warmth. Sometimes it served as a rudimentary form of pest defense armor. Solutions to these infestations ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some households resorted to burning strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel the persistent bugs. Others deliberately slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes directly in the bed, which may have done little for the pests but certainly kept romance to a minimum. It wasn't just physical discomfort either. Fleas were often symbolically viewed as manifestations of sin or moral impurity, serving as constant biting reminders of the fall of man and perhaps poor bedding choices. Entire poems were even composed about fleas, some moralizing in tone, others oddly romantic, because nothing quite says "I love you" like the sentiment, "Let us be united" like the flea that bites us both. So, while modern sleep is typically interrupted by buzzing phones and intrusive streetlights, medieval sleep was far more likely to be disturbed by incessant scratching, involuntary twitching, and the unsettling sensation that something was actively crawling on your shin. Because it almost certainly was. We've all experienced restless nights. But have you ever attempted to fall asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? Probably not. Well, in the Middle Ages, some individuals did precisely that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams quite like being prepared to joust in your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, did not regularly sleep in full, heavy armor. It was hot, incredibly heavy, and loudly clanking. Attempting to roll over in a suit of chainmail is somewhat akin to trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during wartime or while operating in hostile territory, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer, more prudent choice. Comfort was optional, survival was highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on, just in case enemies decided to stage a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like awakening to the sound of thundering hooves and having to don your full suit of armor while still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under siege, men-at-arms might even sleep with their swords or axes positioned directly at their side, functioning as a very aggressive form of bedtime security blanket. Shields often doubled as makeshift pillows. And if the enemy managed to breach the walls, well, at least you wouldn't have to waste time getting dressed. Priorities were clear. Of course, sleeping in armor was not exactly restorative. Iron is not breathable, and chainmail possesses an unfortunate habit of pinching skin. Add to that cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient sounds of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you've created a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not actively engaged in battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous regions. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambesons, which were thick, quilted jackets that offered a bit of protection and slightly more padding than the mere moral support of prayer alone. And lest we forget, armor was not exactly subtle. If you inadvertently rolled over the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else woke up, convinced the apocalypse had arrived. Yet again, in a time when nightly demons, pervasive lice infestations, and pigs sharing your bed were not considered unusual, you might reasonably assume that sleepwalking was just one more minor medieval inconvenience. But oh no, it was far more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you began wandering around in your sleep, people didn't attribute it to stress or simple exhaustion. They immediately assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had urgent, unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation if you wished to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and frequently feared. The idea that someone could rise from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall was viewed less as a harmless parasomnia and more as a devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the period suggest that people were genuinely spooked by sleepwalkers. Picture this unsettling scene. A man in a long nightshirt carrying a candle, his eyes glazed and vacant, mumbling Latin that he didn't actually speak while stepping over livestock. You'd instinctively think ghost or heretic or both, and depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, especially an excess of black bile, which served as the medieval catch-all explanation for anything they couldn't rationally explain. Others theorized it occurred because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body free to clumsily bumble around like an unattended mule. To prevent these unsettling nightly adventures, people tried every conceivable method, from dubious herbal remedies to fervently praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, or in more rural areas, simply tying the sleepwalker's leg to a sturdy chair. If that sounds extreme, consider that some medieval homes featured open hearths, dangerous knives everywhere, and easily overturned chamber pots just waiting to be tragically spilled. In one curious twist, there were persistent rumors of individuals climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers led to the installation of barred windows and occasional theological debates about whether a person could commit a sin while unconscious. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers simply paced, muttered softly, or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone inadvertently sleepwalked into a church, locals might interpret it as a profound divine sign, or immediately call for a thorough cleansing ritual, just to cover all spiritual bases. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through absolute chaos. Church bells, violent thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional surprise siege. For the perpetually sleep-deprived denizens of the Middle Ages, these were merely ambient noises, the medieval equivalent of white noise. Let's begin with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day. Sunrise, designated prayer times, communal meals, and of course, the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you resided anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were likely soundtracked by regular, incessant tolling. At some point, the brain simply accepted it. Bells transformed into the peculiar lullaby of an overslept, overscheduled soul. And it wasn't just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. With no weather apps or triple-glazed windows, you experienced every clap of thunder as if the world might end at any moment. Roofs leaked, windows rattled violently, and chimneys howled like banshees. Still, people managed to sleep. They had no other choice. Work did not cease for insomnia, neither did plowing fields, praying, or frantically running from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events were not always a deal-breaker for bedtime either. In the 14th century, people somehow continued to sleep through devastating famine, relentless war, and even the terrifying Black Death. When grim death carts rolled by in the morning, it was considered more of a somber wake-up call than a cause for widespread panic. And if you didn't wake up, well, some believed that was a mercy. There are even historical records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was rampant, and human bodies simply adjusted. If you labored from sunup to sundown, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your waking hours dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you were going to fall asleep hard. And then there were those who utilized sleep as a kind of desperate escape hatch. Faced with chronic illness, profound grief, or the overwhelming fear of the world literally ending, which was prognosticated roughly every century, some people simply curled up under a cloak, mumbled a brief prayer, and took a deep nap. There's a strange kind of profound wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692, the small village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just a blanket of snow. It was enveloped in a pervasive tension, deep suspicion, and a quiet, insidious fear that seeped into every timber-framed home and frozen field. The inhabitants of Salem were Puritans, strict in their beliefs, deeply devout, and profoundly superstitious. They firmly believed they were constructing a holy community in the American wilderness, a city on a hill, constantly watched over by God and relentlessly stalked by Satan. Life was already incredibly harsh. The village had recently split from Salem town over bitter political and religious disagreements. Crops had failed for several seasons. Smallpox had ravaged nearby communities, leaving many traumatized. There was simmering friction between neighbors, contentious inheritance disputes, and a deep-seated resentment toward outsiders or anyone who didn't quite conform. Add to this volatile mix the long, dark, and bitterly cold New England winter, and something was inevitably bound to break. That breaking point arrived in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to exhibit remarkably strange behaviors. They screamed uncontrollably, they threw objects with inexplicable force, and they contorted their bodies in unnatural, disturbing ways. At times they would fall silent for hours, their eyes wide with apparent terror. Neighbors began to whisper that the girls were cursed. The girls themselves claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, uncertain of how to proceed, summoned a local physician, Dr. William Griggs. After failing to identify any physical cause for their ailments, Griggs delivered the devastating diagnosis that would plunge the entire village into unimaginable chaos: witchcraft. That single, terrifying word ignited the deeply simmering fears already present in Salem. In a place where witches were firmly believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not far-fetched. It was terrifyingly plausible. And now, if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, what ominous implications did that hold for the rest of the vulnerable community? The girls, subtly prodded by both adults and their peers, began to name names. Initially, they accused women living on the margins of society, social misfits and perceived outcasts. But soon the accusations would chillingly extend to the respectable, the wealthy, and even the outwardly pious. Salem was a small village, but what was about to unfold would reverberate far beyond its humble borders. What began as fearful whispers in the dark would soon transform into agonizing cries from the gallows and leave behind a lasting legacy of paranoia that still haunts America's history books. Once the terrifying idea of witchcraft firmly took root in Salem, it spread like invasive ivy, quiet and insidious at first, then relentlessly strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, appeared to grow bolder and more dramatic with each passing day. They convulsed uncontrollably in court, screamed piercingly during public prayers, and claimed they could vividly see dark spirits hovering menacingly over certain villagers. This wasn't merely childhood imagination. It was theatrical, profoundly public, and most disturbingly, widely believed. The first individuals to be accused were those with the least societal protection, women who already existed on the fringes of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering to herself when turned away from doorsteps. People readily claimed her mumbling constituted a curse. She smoked a pipe, she snapped at children. She perfectly fit the convenient mold of a witch because she simply did not fit the rigid mold of a Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne had not attended church in over a year and had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. A woman who openly defied convention? Clearly suspect. Tituba, the enslaved woman within Reverend Parris's household, was considered the most exotic of all. Originating from Barbados, her captivating storytelling, distinctive accent, and unfamiliar folklore deeply frightened the villagers. Under immense pressure, and quite possibly physical beatings, Tituba ultimately confessed to practicing witchcraft. But instead of clearing the tense air, her confession blew the situation wide open. She recounted a chilling story of a tall man dressed in black, a figure explicitly associated with the devil, who compelled her to sign a dark book. She claimed she saw strange, unsettling animals, vivid yellow birds, menacing red cats, and even spectral dogs. But most damning of all, she explicitly stated that there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door to accusations, others eagerly rushed through it. New names were added weekly. Neighbors turned viciously on neighbors. Old grudges were cleverly disguised as righteous accusations. Property disputes mysteriously transformed into spectral assaults. If someone's cow died suddenly, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried during a prayer, surely that was the devil's malevolent doing. The pervasive fear became so infectious that not even the unequivocally innocent dared to speak out. To openly defend an accused witch was to immediately invite suspicion upon yourself. Silence became a desperate form of self-preservation. And so the insidious web of accusations widened, relentlessly trapping the village in its sticky, unseen threads. Logic was rapidly fading. Pervasive hysteria was now firmly in control. As accusations relentlessly mounted and the village reached a fever pitch of paranoia, the colonial government finally intervened. Governor William Phipps, recently appointed and eager to maintain order, established a special court to address the growing chaos. It was formerly called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, derived from the French meaning to hear and determine. But what it truly became was a factory for fear-driven, twisted justice. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary legal tribunal. Its procedural rules were warped by overwhelming panic. Instead of requiring concrete evidence or reliable witnesses, it shockingly permitted something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony claiming that a spirit or specter of the accused individual had afflicted the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream, choking them, that testimony was considered admissible in court. Never mind that the accused could have been sound asleep, attending church, or miles away. It was their spirit supposedly performing the devil's malevolent work. You couldn't possibly cross-examine a dream, and worse, you couldn't effectively disprove it. Children were now treated as crucial star witnesses. Their dramatic seizures, piercing screams, and gasps in court became increasingly theatrical with each passing day. One young girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into violent fits the very moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner dared to look at her, she shrieked. If they deliberately avoided looking at her, she shrieked even louder. These performances were mesmerizingly convincing, and the presiding judges, including the influential Judge Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all as legitimate. Defense lawyers? There were none. The concept simply didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood utterly alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls writhed in agonizing pain. If you confessed, you might be spared immediate death, but only if you named others as accomplices. The system perversely rewarded deception and severely punished silence. Worse still, the trials transformed into disturbing public spectacles. People traveled from neighboring towns to witness them. The accused were paraded into court in heavy shackles, often bewildered, frequently impoverished, and almost always powerless. And yet, not everyone believed in the proceedings. Some townsfolk quietly whispered that the girls were fabricating their afflictions. Others questioned why only certain types of people were consistently being accused, but few dared to speak out openly. Questioning the court implicitly meant questioning the will of God. In Salem, reason had completely stepped aside, and the law had become a distorted mirror reflecting pervasive fear, not impartial justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed its first tragic victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to scandal. Her existing reputation made her an easy target. She wore brightly colored red clothing, operated a tavern, and had been previously accused of witchcraft years earlier. During her trial, neighbors testified that her spirit had pinched them in the night, that their babies had mysteriously died after she passed by, and that she kept enchanted dolls. She adamantly denied everything. Still, the court found her guilty. She was subsequently led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept patch of earth situated just outside Salem. There was no final prayer, no mercy shown. The rope was pulled, the crowd watched in grim silence, and with that single execution, the terrifying machinery of death began to relentlessly churn. The subsequent hangings occurred swiftly. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of these individuals had good standing within the church. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, presented a shocking case, an elderly, pious woman beloved in the community. Even the jury initially found her not guilty, but under immense pressure from the court and the incessantly afflicted girls, the verdict was tragically reversed. Nurse's final haunting words were whispered through the air like a chilling warning: "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it no longer mattered. The noose did not discriminate. In August, more executions followed. On September 22nd, which proved to be the deadliest day, 8 people were brutally hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had voiced doubts about the trials early on, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met an even more horrific fate. Giles stoically refused to enter a plea. The court, unable to proceed with a trial without a plea, resorted to an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. Heavy stones were piled onto his chest, slowly, cruelly, over a period of 3 agonizing days. His final words, as legend famously has it, were, "More weight." By the devastating end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more had tragically died in jail while awaiting trial. Dozens had confessed falsely, in desperation, to save their lives. Over 200 people in total were accused. The gallows cast long, ominous shadows over Salem, not just on the hill, but deep into every heart. Pervasive fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been mercilessly led to the scaffold. While the public executions undeniably claimed the spotlight, hundreds of other accused individuals languished in cramped, foul-smelling jails, desperately waiting for a verdict or a miraculous intervention. Salem's small local jail couldn't possibly contain them all. Accused witches were consequently held in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to cold walls, starving, freezing, and largely forgotten. Most of the accused were not actually witches or even social outcasts. They were ordinary neighbors, friends, parents, and children, people whose only perceived crime was having a quarrel with the wrong person or owning land someone else coveted. In many instances, personal grudges cleverly disguised as divine justice were the true driving force behind the accusations. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and suddenly died. It must be witchcraft. Someone refused to help with firewood. Clearly, they had cursed the axe. Mary Easty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one such poignant case. She was a respected mother of 7, widely known for her piety. Initially released by the court due to insufficient evidence, she was rearrested just days later after new dramatic fits from the afflicted girls. Her second arrest irrevocably sealed her fate. In a final heartbreaking petition to the judges, Mary begged them not for her own life, but but that they put a stop to these proceedings before more innocent blood is shed. She was tragically hanged soon after. Another particularly notable case was Dorothy Good, the innocent 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was subjected to interrogation and under immense pressure allegedly confessed to being a witch. Her answers, a mixture of childish gibberish and profound fear, were chillingly taken as truth. She was imprisoned for 8 agonizing months in chains. When finally released, she was mentally broken, never fully recovering from the traumatic ordeal. Pregnant women were also not spared the horror. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor would later be hanged, was found guilty and sentenced to die. But because she was pregnant, her execution was mercifully delayed. This delay likely saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials finally ended. Accusations snowballed relentlessly. Some accused individuals confessed in desperation to avoid certain death, then in turn named others to shift suspicion away from themselves. Entire families were tragically pulled into the escalating spiral. Fathers, wives, daughters. No one was truly beyond the reach of the accusations. Meanwhile, the jails swelled far beyond their capacity. Food became scarce. Disease spread rapidly among the prisoners. Some died while awaiting trial, lost in the cruel legal limbo of rampant paranoia. And still, new names were added each week. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who was willing to loudly accuse your name. By the fall of 1692, the terrifying spell of hysteria began to visibly crack, not because the court suddenly came to its senses, but because harsh reality forcefully asserted itself. The crucial turning point arrived when the accusations became too audacious. People who had once staunchly supported the trials found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the accusations. Reverend George Burroughs, a former beloved Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was well-educated, articulate, and had previously clashed with influential families in the village. That, apparently, was sufficient grounds for accusation. But on the day of his execution, Burroughs did something truly shocking. He stood calmly on the gallows and flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were firmly believed to be utterly incapable of doing. The crowd fell silent in stunned disbelief. Some wept openly. Even hardened observers were profoundly shaken. But the execution proceeded regardless. That pivotal moment planted a powerful seed of doubt. Then came the accusation of Mary Phipps, the very wife of Governor William Phipps. Suddenly, the rampant hysteria had chillingly reached the very pinnacle of the colony's social ladder. Phipps, already unnerved by growing public criticism and the escalating chaos, finally took decisive action. In October 1692, he officially dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, effectively halting all pending executions and trials. Public sentiment had shifted dramatically. Ministers, once silent or complicit in the proceedings, began to vocally speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, publicly denounced the unreliable use of spectral evidence. "It were better," he famously declared, "that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This was a truly radical thought in a society that had for months believed precisely the opposite. People who had once enthusiastically cheered the trials began to critically question them. The jails were still full, but the insatiable appetite for more blood had visibly dulled. Too many respected figures were now being accused. Too many unequivocally innocent people had been buried. The villagers had begun to grimly realize that this was not divine justice. It was sheer madness. Confessions dried up. Some accusers began to backtrack on their statements, others simply disappeared from public view, and those who had previously shouted the loudest now quietly lowered their eyes. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had finally exhausted itself. The public yearned for stability. The officials desperately sought to save face. And Salem, bruised and deeply ashamed, was at last ready to awaken from its terrifying nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the devastating damage had already been irrevocably done. By late 1692, the very judicial system that had relentlessly fueled the hysteria began to catastrophically collapse under the immense weight of its own inherent absurdity. With the Court of Oyer and Terminer officially disbanded in October, a new, more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature was formed in early 1693. This time, crucial aspects were different. Spectral evidence was no longer permitted as admissible testimony, and the presiding judges were noticeably more skeptical of the accuser's wild, unsubstantiated claims. The direct result? The rate of convictions dramatically slowed. Many accused witches were acquitted outright. Of the 56 cases brought before the new court, the majority of the accused were released. Even those who had previously confessed began to recant their testimonies, admitting that fear, torture, or intense pressure had forced them to lie. The dramatic, theatrical performances of the afflicted girls consequently lost their persuasive power. The most prominent case in the profound unraveling of the trials was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a highly respected minister who himself came under suspicion. While he was never formally charged, the very fact that such a high-ranking devout man could be suspected highlighted how arbitrary and profoundly corrupt the entire process had become. The court, once fiercely zealous, was now cautiously hesitant. They began quietly releasing those still incarcerated, first those with minimal evidence against them, and eventually even those who had confessed to witchcraft under duress. Meanwhile, the families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned the government for the return of his confiscated property. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a determined campaign to clear her name posthumously. In time, profound community shame gradually replaced the pervasive community fear. Church congregations fractured irrevocably. Lifelong friendships were severed. The very fabric of Salem's social order had been completely shredded. Governor Phipps, recognizing the colony's rapidly growing international embarrassment, issued pardons for the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even this newfound freedom came at a steep cost. Many families were forced to pay for their own jail fees before being released. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life, only to be presented with a bill for the sheer privilege of surviving. By the devastating end of the ordeal, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 had died in jail, and over 200 had been formally accused. The court didn't just collapse, it spectacularly imploded, leaving behind a deep crater of guilt, pervasive grief, and widespread disbelief. The trials had concluded, but the agonizing healing process had not even begun. Salem was a village forever altered by the innocent people it had tragically lost, the fundamental justice it had abandoned, and the harsh mirror it was now compelled to confront. The gallows stood silent, the jails had emptied, but Salem was far from peaceful. The town wasn't haunted by vengeful ghosts, but by an oppressive, pervasive guilt. What had begun with a handful of seemingly sick girls had exploded into a devastating communal act of destruction. Families had been torn apart, reputations irrevocably ruined, and innocent lives cruelly ended. And now the survivors had to navigate life amidst the wreckage. Neighbors could no longer look each other directly in the eye. The very same people who once prayed together had testified viciously against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly left town, others simply faded from the public eye. A few, notably Ann Putnam Jr., would later express profound remorse. In 1706, she courageously stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, attributing her actions to delusion by Satan. But for many, the damage inflicted was beyond words. The court officials, too, carried their own heavy burden. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures involved in the trials, was among the very few to publicly admit wrongdoing. In a remarkable act of public penance, he stood during a church service in 1697 while a minister solemnly read out his confession and fervent prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of genuine accountability in a time when most individuals frantically attempted to forget. But forgetting was not an easy task. The families of the condemned began demanding compensation and formal acknowledgement. Over the years, petitions flooded the Massachusetts government, requesting official pardons, the return of confiscated property, and public acknowledgement that the executed were unequivocally innocent. Slowly, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of some of the victims and offered limited financial restitution to their heirs. But even that measure was not comprehensive. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were left out entirely. Whispers of witchcraft never completely vanished from New England, but in Salem, the profound shame became an integral part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps as a desperate attempt to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town harbored a silent hope to bury not just the dead, but the agonizing memory of what had transpired. But the memory stubbornly persisted, in sermons, in stories, in the uncomfortable silence between former friends. Salem had not been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by overwhelming fear, by destructive pride, and by unchecked, pervasive power. And that enduring curse would linger long after the executions finally ceased. The Salem witch trials concluded more than 3 centuries ago, but their profound legacy continues to echo powerfully, not just in textbooks and historical tours, but in how we fundamentally understand justice, the insidious nature of fear, and the inherent fragility of truth. What occurred in 1692 was not simply a strange episode of mass hysteria. It was a catastrophic breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the terrifying face of widespread panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, even ministers, transformed into unwitting executioners simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The courts, ostensibly designed to protect the innocent, became terrifying tools of oppression. Religion was perversely weaponized, testimony morphed into theatrical performance, and chilling silence was equated with guilt. One of the most chilling aspects of Salem's profound tragedy is how rapidly it unfolded. In a mere matter of months, pervasive fear overwhelmingly triumphed over verifiable fact. Old grudges, cleverly disguised as spiritual warfare, swiftly became death sentences. It didn't require actual demons or devils, it only required a widespread, fervent belief in them. But the trials also imparted hard-earned, invaluable lessons that would ripple profoundly through American society in the years and centuries that followed. The Salem episode would be repeatedly cited in crucial debates concerning due process and fundamental civil liberties. The U.S. Constitution, meticulously drafted nearly a century later, would explicitly prohibit practices like ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, which were the very measures that had in effect unjustly doomed the accused in Salem. The fundamental guarantee of a right to legal counsel, the right to directly face one's accusers, and the strict requirement for concrete evidence were hard-won principles forged in part from the tragic ashes of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the phrase witch hunt has become a widely recognized shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it's often used with little regard for the actual terror and suffering those words historically represent. In truth, Salem was not a mere metaphor. It was a tangible town where innocent people were tragically hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems ostensibly designed to protect them. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: fear, when left unchecked, can rapidly become its own insidious form of tyranny. And when that fear is tragically legitimized, by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, it becomes almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials stand as a stark cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how easily reason can fall when pervasive fear is granted undue authority. The gallows may be long gone, the courtrooms now quiet, but the warning still powerfully stands. Truth is inherently fragile, justice is not automatic, and history possesses an uncanny habit of repeating itself unless we meticulously remember. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the elite, yet slightly eccentric, Fulvia family, an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics. Though not one of the oldest patrician clans, the Fulvia had produced esteemed consuls, formidable generals, and eloquent orators. Their bloodline carried both intense ambition and a distinct taste for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his bumbling speech than his lasting political legacy. His nickname Bambalio literally referred to his stammer. But Fulvia, she was no stammer. She was undeniably born to command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been constantly surrounded by the sharp-edged, ruthless world of Roman power. Senators and generals frequently debated pivotal policies in her home. News of elections and pervasive treachery were daily occurrences. She would have keenly observed how politics wasn't just played out in the Roman Forum, but intricately woven into marriages, funerals, whispered rumors, and clandestine backroom deals. Women in elite Roman households were typically expected to be quiet, supportive partners, refined, educated, and obedient. Fulvia would defiantly break all of those expectations. She was independently wealthy, highly educated, and exceptionally well-connected, and she was acutely aware of it. While her early life remains somewhat hazy in the historical record, her later actions strongly suggest a young woman who was remarkably observant, politically astute, and utterly unafraid. This was not someone who quietly faded into the background. She possessed a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and an unwavering will to act, even within the male-dominated space of Roman governance. This was also a period of unprecedented instability in Rome. The Republic was rapidly unraveling. Civil wars, populist revolts, and brutal power struggles between formidable generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were transforming Rome into a volatile pressure cooker. The old established rules were catastrophically collapsing, and Fulvia came of age directly in the midst of this turbulent chaos. Rather than recoiling from the pervasive disorder, Fulvia would skillfully learn to manipulate it. Her early life experiences did not produce the kind of modest matron Rome typically idealized. Instead, it produced a powerful woman who perceived politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a direct battlefield to be mastered. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each one a radical, pivotal player in Roman history. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry into power. She would actively command armies, boldly lead revolts, and become the very first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not symbolically as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't truly ready for Fulvia, but she was unequivocally ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a distinct flair for chaos, public scandal, and street-level power. To many of the Roman elite, he was a dangerous, disruptive force. To the Roman masses, he was a revered hero. And to Fulvia, he represented a significant strategic opportunity. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, united Fulvia with the man who had effectively turned the Roman Republic into his personal, chaotic stage. Clodius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of established tradition. He had once notoriously disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred, female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home, scandalous behavior that only seemed to inexplicably enhance his popularity. He later controversially renounced his patrician status to run for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that granted him immense veto power over the venerable Senate. Clodius understood Rome's complex street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a passive, demure consort, was actively right there beside him. She was not a silent partner. Roman sources strongly suggest that Fulvia actively participated in her husband's tumultuous political world. She engaged directly with his fervent supporters, was visibly present during his public campaigns, and shrewdly managed their household as a central hub for Clodian politics. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But this powerful alliance came at a devastating cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was brutally murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his bitter political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent profound shockwaves throughout Rome. But Fulvia was certainly not about to mourn quietly. She meticulously staged a political funeral that historians still discuss today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, deliberately exposing his bloodied wounds for maximum emotional effect. The public was horrified and instantly enraged. Riots erupted violently. The esteemed Senate house was burned to the ground. Fulvia had brilliantly transformed personal grief into a powerful public uprising. This was her first major political act, and it proved devastatingly effective. Her remarkable ability to manipulate public emotion, skillfully use spectacle as a strategic tool, and wield her deceased husband's legacy as a potent weapon established her as a new, formidable player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had powerfully stepped out of his shadow, and Rome would never perceive her in the same way again. Fulvia didn't linger in protracted mourning. In Rome, political capital possessed a notoriously short shelf life, and she understood that reality better than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage, this time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rapidly rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate and vocal supporters. On the surface, Curio appeared an unlikely match. He possessed a flamboyant reputation and an undeniable taste for public drama, but beneath the bravado was a shrewd and capable political operator. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio wielded enormous influence during one of Rome's most volatile and uncertain periods. The Republic teetered precariously between impending civil war and fragile peace, caught between Caesar's soaring ambitions and the Senate's staunch resistance. Fulvia recognized in Curio not merely a husband, but a strategic bridge to the next ascending power block. This was no romantic rebound, it was a meticulously calculated political alliance. With Clodius now gone, Fulvia desperately needed a new political anchor, someone who could effectively carry forward the populist legacy her first husband had so skillfully built, and someone who possessed Julius Caesar's crucial backing. Curio perfectly fit both requirements. Through him, Fulvia remained tightly embedded within the constantly shifting power dynamics of Rome. She didn't just marry into the political movement, she actively helped shape it. Fulvia ensured that Clodius's fervent supporters remained active and mobilized, cleverly rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged. But the Roman world was rapidly collapsing. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey dramatically escalated into full-blown civil war. Curio immediately threw himself into the conflict, decisively siding with Caesar. Fulvia, as always, remained deeply politically involved. She reportedly helped organize crucial support and managed vital resources for her husband's military campaign. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's strategic position, but it proved to be a disaster. He was ambushed and brutally killed by the forces of King Juba I of Numidia. His death was exceptionally brutal, and his army was completely annihilated. Once again, Fulvia found herself widowed, and once again, Rome waited to see if she would finally fade into the background. She did not. Curio's death only served to solidify her status as a formidable political widow possessing dangerous resilience. She had now tragically lost 2 husbands to Rome's incessant civil unrest, and both had died fighting for powerful populist causes. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic, defining chapter was still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and fiercely loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BCE, wasn't merely a romantic attachment. It was a calculated merger of immense power. Fulvia had already proven herself a master of Roman street politics and public opinion. Antony, rapidly ascending through the military and political ranks, desperately needed that kind of savvy support in Rome. Together, they formed one of the most politically potent and influential couples of the late Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to the harsh realities of bloodshed and pervasive betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and skillfully outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony was no stranger to public scandal either. He indulged in heavy drinking, gambled excessively, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic. But with Fulvia, he had found someone who could do far more than merely entertain him. She could fiercely defend his interests, effectively hold his complex alliances together, and powerfully rally supporters when he was away on military campaign. And Antony, despite his often brash exterior, clearly understood her invaluable worth. He allowed Fulvia to exercise a level of authority that no Roman woman had ever publicly wielded before. She opened his correspondence, she issued orders in his absence, she sat in on crucial political meetings and directly influenced appointments. Roman sources, largely hostile to her, frequently depicted her as overbearing, shrewish, and insatiably power-hungry. But what truly disturbed them most wasn't her ambition. It was that she overtly acted like a Roman man in a world that possessed no accepted language or framework for such a powerful woman. After Caesar's brutal assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into utter chaos once more. Antony swiftly moved to secure his position as Caesar's natural political heir, but it was Fulvia who effectively held Rome itself. While Antony formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia served as his formidable representative in the capital, meticulously managing patronage networks, coordinating with influential street gangs, and ensuring Antony's supporters remained mobilized. She even helped strategically arrange Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter, Clodia, to him, an alliance that would later dramatically implode. In public, Fulvia appeared not merely as Antony's wife, but as his powerful proxy. Roman coins were even minted bearing both Antony's image and her own name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her elevated status and direct political agency. She wasn't relegated to the shadows of power. She boldly stood in its full, blazing glare. But power in Rome was always, ultimately, borrowed. And Fulvia was about to rigorously test the limits of how far a woman could go before Rome inevitably snapped back. While Mark Antony tirelessly pursued military campaigns and intricate political deals across the vast Roman world, it was Fulvia who effectively controlled the bustling streets of Rome. She wasn't merely his wife. She was his de facto regent in all but official name. In a period where pervasive violence, strategic bribery, and raw personal influence maintained a semblance of order, Fulvia proved she could play the ruthless political game as skillfully as, if not more effectively than, any man in the venerable Senate. Rome, in the immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination, was a chaotic battlefield without conventional swords. Power had become a constantly moving, elusive target. Fulvia intuitively understood this, and she firmly anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his powerful political substitute. She expertly directed allies, skillfully dealt with the urban plebs, shrewdly negotiated with various factions, and most daringly, waged an intense war with persuasive words and ample silver. She financed loyal troops, offered crucial bribes to maintain public order, and meticulously ensured that any legislation passed unequivocally favored Antony's future ambitions. Some ancient sources, particularly hostile ones like Appian and Cassius Dio, portray Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even outright warmongering. But beneath the undeniable misogynistic exaggeration lies the powerful truth of a woman actively doing politics in a world that had no established protocol for a woman doing anything beyond weaving and mourning. Fulvia was actively building vital coalitions, backing military commanders, and even issuing decrees, functions typically reserved exclusively for male senators and consuls. She also made prominent public appearances and maintained strong, politically crucial relationships with veteran soldiers, a vital demographic in the brutal power struggles of the late Republic. While Antony was campaigning extensively in the East, Fulvia was often the very public face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing pivotal decisions about land distribution, and constantly reminding the soldiers that their unwavering loyalty to Antony came with tangible rewards. But this audacious accumulation of power inevitably came at a steep cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly the influential faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, deeply resented Fulvia's immense influence. They viewed her as a meddling, aggressive woman who wielded too much sway over legions, laws, and crucial loyalties. Her remarkable ability to act without male guardianship was not just profoundly threatening, it was utterly unprecedented. Fulvia was not naive. She acutely perceived that the tension between Antony and Octavian was rapidly escalating. She could clearly see that their uneasy alliance was fracturing. And she intuitively understood something that neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Roman Republic was simply not large enough for both of them. So Fulvia began meticulously preparing for the next inevitable phase. Not diplomacy, but direct confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now she was ready to boldly seize it into her own hands. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She directly went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus. And she didn't do it quietly. With her husband, Mark Antony, still strategically stationed in the east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, took it upon themselves to directly challenge Octavian's burgeoning authority in Italy. The stated cause? Ostensibly, it was to defend Antony's critical interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans fiercely loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's unmistakable fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just mere politics. This was an outright military rebellion powerfully led by a Roman woman, the very first and only time in all of Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and meticulously organize a full-blown civil war. The ensuing conflict, famously known as the Perusine War, was primarily triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which forcibly displaced many Italian citizens to reward his own loyal soldiers. Fulvia shrewdly seized on the growing public discontent, skillfully portraying Octavian as a tyrannical ruler and a treacherous betrayer of Caesar's revered legacy. With Lucius acting as her visible frontman in the Senate and Fulvia meticulously organizing behind the scenes, they successfully raised 8 legions and seized control of the strategic city of Perusia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this was unequivocally Fulvia's war. Ancient sources strongly suggest she was far more personally invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She bravely rallied troops, incited the public, and even corresponded directly with various generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, issuing decisive orders and forcing Lucius into confrontations he likely preferred to avoid. Octavian, though initially surprised, acted with swift precision. He promptly besieged Perugia through the winter of 41 to 40 BCE, effectively cutting off all supplies and systematically hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, trapped between dwindling food supplies and escalating political betrayal, watched her bold gamble tragically unravel. By early 40 BCE, the city finally surrendered. Lucius Antonius was surprisingly spared, likely as a calculated gesture to avoid alienating Antony, but Fulvia was immediately exiled. The formidable woman who had once commanded riots, strategically arranged marriages, influenced armies, and swayed public opinion, was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she desperately hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony did not come rushing to her side. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had tragically eroded in the fog of war and geographical distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his explicit blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had ever before, wage a civil war. And now the Republic had made her pay the ultimate price. Banished from the heart of Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had ironically become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players. She had bravely gone to war not for personal gain, but explicitly in her husband's name. She genuinely believed she was defending Mark Antony's vital interests, his honor, and perhaps their shared grand vision of Rome. But what awaited her in exile was not a hero's triumphant welcome. It was profound silence. Fulvia had risked absolutely everything: her high status, her crucial alliances, her very life. And yet Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already deeply entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic relationship had already fully blossomed or was merely brewing, the symbolism of the situation was utterly crushing. While Fulvia was diligently raising legions and enduring siege, Antony was luxuriously raising goblets at lavish banquets beside a foreign queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but profoundly politically. Fulvia had fought a devastating war to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in response, he effectively abandoned her to her fate. Some ancient historians, particularly Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for launching the Perusine War without his direct, explicit approval. Others argue he secretly welcomed her downfall. It conveniently cleared the way for a crucial marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would have never tolerated. Still, Fulvia was not entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, who remained fiercely loyal to her, urged a reconciliation, but her health had already begun to significantly fail. After enduring intense siege, devastating exile, and profound betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, possibly from illness, overwhelming stress, or a broken heart, or a combination of all three. She was approximately 43 years old. Her death conveniently provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly afterward and readily agreed to marry Octavian's sister Octavia as a vital part of a renewed peace treaty. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to directly challenge their designs, was finally gone. Fulvia's formidable legacy would soon be tragically overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myth would nearly erase every other powerful Roman woman of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the powerful prototype. She didn't wield power from behind a discreet curtain. She bravely marched directly into it, stood at its very center, and audaciously dared to command armies in a male-dominated world that traditionally treated women as mere furniture. Rome didn't know how to effectively deal with her, so it simply attempted to erase her from history. But the smoldering ashes of her rebellion would linger, and her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death in 40 BCE, the powerful men she had once skillfully maneuvered, Antony, Octavian, and even her former allies, began the quiet, deliberate work of rewriting her legacy. She could no longer defend herself, so the narrative was meticulously shaped by her triumphant enemies and the uneasy survivors of her immense ambition. And like so many other powerful women throughout history, Fulvia became a convenient scapegoat. Ancient sources, predominantly penned by men with vested political interests, painted her as the sole reason for the devastating Perusine War, the bitter rift between Antony and Octavian, and even the general pervasive disorder of the Republic. Appian, Cassius Dio, and Plutarch consistently depict her as overbearing, intensely jealous, and relentlessly driven by an insatiable lust for power. They explicitly blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into the conflict, for relentlessly antagonizing Octavian, and even for Antony's eventual profound estrangement from Rome. But were these accusations fair or accurate? Hardly. Fulvia had operated entirely within a brutal political climate, where violence and manipulation were not only accepted but expected, at least if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and demonstrably far less ruthless than Octavian would eventually prove to be. Her only true deviation was that she was a woman boldly acting like a Roman man, and Rome simply did not possess the societal framework to process or accept that. She wasn't cloistered in the home, quietly weaving or serving as a mere political ornament. She was actively writing letters to powerful generals, expertly organizing street mobs, and successfully commanding unwavering loyalty from troops. And that made her profoundly dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the very man whose legacy she had fiercely fought to preserve, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife. After reconciling with Octavian and expediently marrying his sister, Antony utilized Fulvia's death as a convenient diplomatic cleansing. Her memory became the tragic price of his continued political survival. There were no monuments grandly raised in her honor, no elaborate funeral, no public mourning speeches in the Senate. Just profound silence. Yet her enemies couldn't erase her entirely. Fulvia had achieved too much. She had raised armies, steered elections, meticulously negotiated alliances, and fiercely fought a civil war. She was the very first Roman woman whose name explicitly appeared on coinage, not symbolically as a deity or a metaphor, but as a direct political agent. The damage to her reputation was undeniably deliberate, but so too was her undeniable presence in the historical record. Despite every calculated attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia steadfastly refused to vanish. Her remarkable defiance still powerfully echoes. You just have to listen past the men who attempted to define her. Fulvia's story may end in historical silence, but her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers struggled immensely to accurately place her within Rome's grand narrative, precisely because Fulvia shattered every single rule of what a Roman woman was traditionally supposed to be. She didn't just subtly advise power from the shadows, she actively became power. And that singular fact rendered her both utterly unforgettable and profoundly unsettling to a deeply patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whispered suggestions and strategic marriages, Fulvia boldly shouted through policy decisions, direct warfare, and compelling political theater. She was not merely a consort. she was a formidable commander. And yet, she was remembered more for her defiance and perceived audacity than for her tangible accomplishments. Roman historians couldn't properly reconcile a woman who refused to remain in her prescribed place, so they conveniently rewrote her as shrill, insatiably power-hungry, and inherently disruptive. But read carefully between the lines of their biased accounts, and a strikingly different figure emerges. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to successfully mint coins bearing her own name. She skillfully organized complex political factions, leveraged marriage as a potent tactical weapon, and manipulated Roman street politics with stunning effectiveness. She moved through the tumultuous civil wars of the 1st century BCE, not as a mere bystander, but as a central active player, a woman whose immense influence genuinely terrified senators and profoundly shaped the very fate of powerful triumvirs. Her downfall was not attributable to incompetence. It was directly due to unfortunate timing and primarily her gender. Had she been born a man, she might well have been remembered as a second Caesar or a more charming Cato. Instead, she was tragically cast as the wicked woman who dared far too much. Still, her powerful legacy quietly lingered. Later Roman women, such as Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra herself, though from a different cultural world, would all operate in various ways within the shadow Fulvia helped carve. They would expertly manipulate emperors, boldly wield armies, and shrewdly control succession. But Fulvia accomplished it first, and notably, without any imperial title to shield her. Today, modern historians have commendably begun re-examining Fulvia with fresh, unbiased eyes. No longer solely a cautionary tale, she is increasingly being recognized as one of the most politically active and influential women in all of Roman history, someone who profoundly tested the rigid boundaries of female power and ultimately paid the steep price for it. She didn't simply exist in the age of triumvirs, she courageously challenged them directly. And while Rome may have strenuously tried to erase her from memory, Fulvia left indelible fingerprints in every corner of its profound collapse. Not a footnote, but a powerful force, a woman undeniably centuries ahead of her turbulent time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country precariously teetering between two starkly different worlds, one deeply rooted in centuries-old systems of systemic oppression, and another yearning desperately to breathe free. In the American Deep South, racial segregation wasn't merely a pervasive social norm, it was explicitly enforced by law. Black Americans were brutally barred from restaurants, schools, public buses, voting booths, and even basic drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant and unchecked. Horrific lynchings still occasionally occurred. And in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling police dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. But profound change was rapidly approaching, and it was not asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged powerfully into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, courageous freedom rides, and widespread boycotts had become familiar headlines across the nation. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names. They were powerful symbols of defiance and resilience. The March on Washington wasn't conceived from a single casual conversation. It was the direct result of escalating frustration combined with fierce, unyielding hope. Black Americans were no longer content with patiently waiting for justice. They were unequivocally demanding civil rights, and they were determined to make their collective voices heard where it mattered most, the very capital of the nation. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. had been circulating for decades. Philip Randolph, a venerable labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, its primary purpose was to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That particular protest was ultimately called off after Roosevelt capitulated and signed an executive order addressing the issue. But now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Randolph, along with other prominent civil rights leaders, including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the powerful vision. And this time, they weren't just marching for jobs, they were marching for fundamental human dignity, for guaranteed voting rights, for comprehensive school desegregation, for equal pay, and most importantly, for the basic human right to live free of fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations collaboratively came together to plan it, despite their many internal disagreements, because they profoundly understood the immense power of a unified front. The countdown had officially begun. Buses were being meticulously organized, flyers were rapidly spreading, word of mouth was moving faster than traditional newspapers. And across the entire country, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable and pivotal moments in American history. The dream was steadily taking shape, one determined footstep at a time. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C. was no small feat, but meticulously planning one for over 100,000 people, potentially even more, was an act of sheer madness. Logistically, it sounded like an insurmountable nightmare. Securing food, water, transportation, massive sound systems, adequate bathrooms, necessary permits, effective crowd control, and comprehensive safety plans. And yet, somehow, they made it happen. At the very center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often relegated to the background for political reasons, was an undisputed master strategist. Rustin had once meticulously studied nonviolence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's devoted followers in India. He had personally marched, been unjustly jailed, brutally beaten, and continuously surveilled by the FBI. But nothing seemed to faze him. He perceived the March on Washington as a unique opportunity to demonstrate to the entire world what disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve when coordinated with military precision. In just 8 intensive weeks, Rustin and his dedicated team transformed the ambitious idea into a tangible reality. The march was formally titled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was deliberately framed to encompass both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the enduring spiritual symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who meticulously ensured that the demands were equally focused on addressing unemployment, advocating for a minimum wage, and championing workers' rights, as much as they were about fundamental civil rights. Meanwhile, deep tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were deeply nervous, profoundly so. They feared widespread riots, a violent backlash, or even worse, catastrophic bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would remain entirely peaceful. Still, the National Guard was placed on standby, hospitals in D.C. were put on high alert, and liquor sales were strictly banned for the entire day. Federal workers were even advised they could stay home. And then there was the ongoing question of internal unity. The Big Six civil rights organizations, CP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, frequently clashed over tactical approaches. Some advocated for more radical action, others preferred greater diplomatic engagement. SNCC's young firebrands were growing increasingly impatient with King's steadfast, nonviolent approach. But they all collectively agreed on one crucial point. The time for silence had definitively passed. Rustin's meticulously crafted plan read like a military operation. Every single bus and train was tracked. Every speaker's time was meticulously timed to the minute. Every route had dedicated marshals specially trained in crowd control. They weren't just planning a march. They were precisely orchestrating a transformative moment that would profoundly shake the conscience of an entire nation. August 28, 1963. A sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C., the sun was already intensely hot by 9 a.m., and the oppressive humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt. But it did not deter them. From every corner of the country they came. Black individuals, white individuals, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best attire, others clutched protest signs they had made. They arrived by bus, by train, by carpool, and even on foot. Over 250,000 people in total, converging on the National Mall like a steadily rising tide of hope. And yet, there was no chaos. Despite the government's pervasive fear of riots and civil unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm and orderly. Dedicated volunteers directed foot traffic with precision. The Red Cross tirelessly handed out refreshing water. Groups sang powerful freedom songs, held hands in solidarity, and cheered enthusiastically as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and fervent chants of jobs and freedom echoing off the majestic marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities also joined the historic event. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan. But no one was there seeking autographs. They were there to witness history unfold and to lend their voices to a cause far bigger than any one individual. The crowd remained orderly but vibrantly energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence whatsoever. Instead, there was a palpable, shared understanding that this was not just a protest. It was a sacred, pivotal moment. For many Black Americans, merely standing on the Mall felt like a quiet yet profound act of revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to audibly declare, "We are here," directly in front of the very same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone. It was a full-circle moment, generations in the making. At precisely noon, the official program commenced. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, diverse ideologies, and various regions, but all profoundly united in their core message. Speakers passionately demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, and an immediate end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang with soul-stirring power. Marian Anderson, who had once been unjustly banned from singing at Constitution Hall due to her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky. As the hours passed, the tension palpably grew, not from unrest, but from mounting anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken, and when he finally did, the world would stop, listen intently, and forever remember. The march wasn't just making history, it was actively becoming legend, minute by minute. By mid-afternoon, the vast crowd had settled into a profound quiet, not because they were tired, but because they intuitively knew what was about to transpire. Standing in the shade of the majestic Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the powerful fire building within him. He carried meticulously prepared remarks, typed and collaboratively written with his trusted advisors the night before. But what the world would forever remember wasn't what had been typed. It was what flowed organically from his heart. He began with measured intensity, eloquently outlining the grim realities of segregation, systemic police violence, and repeatedly broken promises. 100 years later, he powerfully stated, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, "The Negro is still not free." His resonant voice rose and fell like a powerful sermon. He masterfully used repetition, rhythm, and calculated silence not as mere fillers, but as integral instruments of persuasion. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding in agreement, some quietly wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply yet powerfully read, "Now." But it was what happened next that irrevocably changed the tone of the entire event, and arguably, the fundamental trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She suddenly cried out with fervent passion, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium with renewed conviction, and launched into a passage he'd delivered before, but never with this profound impact. "I have a dream," he declared, and the vast crowd leaned in intently. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each subsequent phrase resonated louder, clearer, and more resolute than the last. "I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It wasn't merely a speech anymore. It was a profound vision, a fervent prayer, a literal lightning bolt through history. By the time King concluded with the powerful words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted in a spontaneous explosion of applause, tears, and shouts of unbridled joy. They instinctively knew they had just witnessed something far more significant than mere oratory. They had heard prophecy. The profound power of the March on Washington wasn't solely derived from the impactful speeches or the stirring music. It was fundamentally in the people themselves. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming. They arrived from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and every other state in between. Some were seasoned activists who had courageously marched a dozen times before. Others had never left their hometowns until this historic day. They meticulously packed lunches, endured bus rides lasting over 20 hours, and even slept in their church clothes just to be present. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steelworkers, postal clerks, who perceived themselves not as political figures, but as essential witnesses to history. They didn't just desire change, they were the change. There were also numerous children in the crowd, young black girls with colorful ribbons in their hair, boys proudly holding hand-drawn signs. Parents carefully hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could glimpse the distant Lincoln Memorial and hear the speakers' voices powerfully carried over loudspeakers. To them, this was not just an event, it was the dawning of a new world. Some faces notably stood out in the crowd. There was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so intensely fiery and uncompromising that senior leaders requested him to temper its tone just minutes before he stepped onto the stage. He reluctantly agreed, but only barely. His fervent call for radical change still powerfully resonated through the crowd. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement representing other vital civil rights women. The organizers had faced significant criticism for subtly sidelining female voices. Bates's brief but powerful message underscored a harsh reality. Even within a movement ostensibly about equality, some voices still struggled profoundly to be heard. Also present were dedicated union organizers, revered rabbis, compassionate nuns, earnest priests, and students from every conceivable background. They did not all agree on precise strategy. Some favored King's nonviolent approach, others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant posture. But for that one pivotal day, those differences momentarily dissolved. Unity powerfully triumphed. It was a visual symphony of American possibility. White and black hands linked in unwavering solidarity, Freedom Now buttons proudly pinned to chests, and the collective sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd weren't just passively watching history unfold. They were actively shaping it, and none of them would ever forget what they had witnessed. While the world observed unity, inspiration, and profound poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What appeared to be a perfectly synchronized movement was, in truth, held together by sheer willpower, immense sweat, and a great deal of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the brilliant chief architect of the march, had to contend not only with complex logistics, but also with treacherous internal politics. He was constantly under intense scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the entire movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once famously threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That pervasive threat haunted every stage of the planning. Then there was the contentious issue of women's voices. Despite the absolutely critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was indeed present in the crowd that day, revered by all, but she was not granted the microphone. Behind the powerful optics of the march lay the uncomfortable truth. The movement itself still grappled with its own internal hierarchies and pervasive blind spots. Even within the Big Six organizations, friction continually simmered. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly disillusioned with the frustratingly slow pace of change and the older generation's persistent insistence on moderation. They desired to confront systemic racism more aggressively. CORE harbored similar frustrations, but unity was deemed too important, at least for that one historic day. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to relentlessly spy on the organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, shadowed key figures, and meticulously compiled damning dossiers. They were firmly convinced the march would inevitably turn violent, or that communists would somehow hijack the entire event. When nothing of the sort transpired, they simply redoubled their surveillance efforts, particularly targeting Dr. King. And let's not forget the immense financial cost. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions in today's currency. Most of it was raised through dedicated unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled desperately until the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also profoundly human, imperfect, undeniably messy, deeply political, and ultimately unfinished, just like the very country it sought to heal. The sun began its slow descent behind the Washington Monument as the vast crowds gradually dispersed. People embraced, openly cried, sang freedom songs, and lingered for as long as they possibly could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The powerful speeches had been delivered, the signs had been raised high, and the world had intently watched. And now the crucial question hung heavy in the humid August air: what happens next? In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity. Some outlets simply called it orderly and dignified, which was thinly veiled code for "no one rioted." Few publications dedicated much space to the specific economic demands of the march, such as the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage, equivalent to approximately $20 today. But everyone extensively covered Dr. King's seminal speech. That, at least, could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the very idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and perhaps genuine surprise. He publicly called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward. But legislative movement remained frustratingly slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the determined claws of Southern opposition. Some activists were deeply disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate, tangible action. Instead, it was back to the relentless grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who had paid the ultimate price for justice. Just weeks later, that harsh reality struck hard. On September 15th, 1963, 4 innocent black girls were tragically killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been eloquently voiced, yes, but the pervasive nightmare was far from over. Still, something profound had undeniably changed. The March on Washington marked a new pivotal phase in the civil rights movement. It powerfully proved that mass protest could be disciplined, incredibly impactful, and utterly impossible to ignore. It successfully brought together a broader coalition than ever before. Labor unions, faith leaders, influential celebrities, passionate students, and working-class Americans all in one place, profoundly united by the cause of justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a resonant voice, an inspiring dream, a powerful speech that would be quoted, meticulously studied, and echoed across the world for generations to come. The march was over, but the arduous road was just beginning, and that road would soon lead through bloodshed, transformative legislation, and profound societal change. The March on Washington didn't just rattle the conscience of America, it fundamentally reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as an audacious act of protest transformed into a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's enduring legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood fundamental justice, vibrant democracy, and the immense power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march didn't yield immediate direct victories, but it undeniably created irresistible momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in all public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, 775. And in 1965, the pivotal Voting Rights Act followed, striking directly at the very heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these crucial bills have passed without the march? Possibly, but would they have possessed the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech delivered that day propelled him into a new realm of influence and recognition. He ascended from a respected leader to a global icon. But such immense fame came with a heavy cost: increased surveillance, constant threats, and ultimately his tragic assassination in 1968. The dream he so eloquently spoke of on those steps would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march vividly demonstrated what unwavering unity could achieve. It provided organizers with a clear blueprint for large-scale mobilization, and it profoundly inspired an entire generation of activists, both within the U.S. and internationally. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would all cite the March on Washington as a powerful model. But the legacy extends beyond mere historical impact. The compelling language of the march, the powerful idea of jobs and freedom, the enduring image of peaceful resistance, the resonant echoes of "I have a dream," all of it still powerfully pulses through modern protest movements. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, the spirit and echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant and every handheld cardboard sign. In Washington, D.C. today, King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the iconic Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering likeness carved in stone, with profound words from that August day etched indelibly into the granite. But the real memorial is not merely in stone. It lives vibrantly in classrooms, in voting booths, in protests, and in countless voices refusing to stay silent. Because the dream was never meant to simply rest in history books. It was meant to be actively lived. And the profound legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that transformative summer afternoon when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the symbolic shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in countless textbooks, compelling documentaries, and poignant museum exhibits. Dr. King's powerful speech is meticulously taught in schools, his voice steady and strong, echoing in the national memory like a sacred, enduring refrain. But for many, the fundamental question persists. Has the dream truly been realized, or has it merely been agonizingly delayed? In some respects, progress is undeniable. The oppressive legal framework of segregation was comprehensively dismantled. Voting rights, though now facing renewed assault in many states, were hard-won through immense bloodshed, tireless marches, and arduous court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was utterly unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once explicitly illegal in much of the country, is now firmly protected by federal law. These are not small accomplishments. They are monumental victories painstakingly carved out by relentless struggle. And yet, the original core demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by King's iconic speech, still powerfully echo unresolved. The crucial call for a living wage remains unmet. Pervasive racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain deeply entrenched. Police brutality, the very issue that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite widespread outrage and persistent protest. The profound dream of true economic justice, of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or the color of one's skin, is still far from becoming a complete reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have courageously taken up the mantle, often utilizing the powerful imagery and compelling rhetoric of the 1963 march as both profound inspiration and sharp indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same historic streets, and demand the very same basic human rights. But they do so in a world dramatically transformed by social media, pervasive surveillance, and new evolving forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never intended to be the definitive conclusion. It was a critical flashpoint, a powerful stake driven into the ground that boldly declared, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a fervent declaration, not a final resolution. So the dream undeniably remains, battered, challenged, continually reinterpreted, but vibrantly alive. Whether it is ultimately deferred, distorted, or one day fully fulfilled depends not on the past, but profoundly on us. On the crucial choices we make, the injustices we courageously confront, and the unwavering courage we summon to march again and again until the dream truly becomes a shared, lived reality for all.